Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1907, nestled deep within the remote hollows of Howell County, Missouri, stood a two-story timber house that would become the center of one of the most unsettling family mysteries ever documented in the Ozarks region. The McCraw homestead sat approximately 8 miles southeast of West Plains, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through dense stands of oak and hickory trees, whose branches formed a natural canopy, so thick that even during midday, the approach to the house remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. The house itself was unremarkable by local standards. It had weathered cedar siding that had turned a dark gray from decades of exposure to mountain weather, a foundation of fieldstone gathered from the surrounding hillsides, and a steep pitched roof designed to shed the heavy snows that occasionally blanketed the region during harsh winters. What made this dwelling notorious among local residents was not its appearance, which matched dozens of other homesteads scattered throughout the isolated mountain communities, but rather what three sisters who lived there spent decades trying to hide from the outside world. The property encompassed nearly 160 acres of mixed forest and cleared land, with a small creek running along its eastern boundary that provided water for the household, and the modest collection of livestock that the family maintained. The nearest neighbors lived more than 2 miles away, connected by walking paths that became nearly impassable during the winter months when snow and ice made travel through the mountains treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Martha McCraw, the eldest sister at 34 years of age, had inherited the property following the death of their parents in a logging accident that occurred during the harsh winter of 1904. Her sisters, Ruth, who was 31, and Esther, the youngest at 28, had remained with her rather than seek marriages or employment elsewhere in the region. This arrangement seemed perfectly practical to their neighbors, as unmarried women of their age faced severely limited opportunities in the isolated mountain communities, where traditional expectations centered around family life and domestic responsibilities. The McCraw land, while modest in terms of agricultural potential, provided sufficient timber resources and cleared acreage to sustain a small household through careful management and the kind of self-reliant lifestyle that characterized most families in the area. Local records housed in the Howell County Courthouse indicate that the sisters maintained what appeared to be a respectable standing within their community during the years immediately following their parents' death. They attended services regularly at the Methodist Chapel in nearby Mountain View, a small settlement that served as the unofficial center of social and religious life for families scattered throughout the surrounding mountains. The sisters participated in seasonal barn raisings and harvest gatherings, contributing their labor and skills to community projects in the traditional manner expected of established families in the region, according to testimonies collected by local residents years later. Martha McCraw was considered particularly knowledgeable about herbal remedies and traditional healing practices that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. The first documented indication that something was seriously amiss at the McCraw homestead came in late September 1907, when Jeremiah Booth, a traveling minister who had been conducting revival meetings throughout the scattered settlements of southern Missouri, sought shelter at their property during an unexpected early frost that had descended on the region with unusual suddenness. Booth later recorded detailed observations in his personal journal, a leather-bound volume that was discovered decades later in a trunk stored at the Mountain View Historical Society during a routine inventory of donated materials. According to his carefully written entries, Booth arrived at the McCraw homestead during the late afternoon hours following a day of travel through increasingly difficult terrain as the temperature dropped and frost began forming on the vegetation along the mountain paths. Booth's journal indicates that he was denied access to the house, despite clear evidence that all three sisters were present on the property and aware of his arrival. through a crack in the wooden shutters that covered the front windows of the house. He observed what he described as a deeply troubling scene that remained fixed in his memory for the remainder of his life. All three McCraw sisters were standing motionless in their front parlor, positioned in a rough triangle formation, with their faces turned upward toward the ceiling above them. Their posture, and absolute stillness, suggested they were listening intently to something that Booth himself could not detect from his position outside the house. Most disturbing to Booth was the duration of this vigil. According to his careful timing using his pocket watch, the sisters remained in these exact positions for nearly 25 minutes, never acknowledging his repeated calls for assistance or responding to the increasingly restless pawing and nickering of his horse at their front gate. The temperature continued to drop as evening approached, and Booth noted that frost was beginning to form on the windows of the house. Yet the sisters showed no sign of awareness regarding his presence or the deteriorating weather conditions that made shelter an urgent necessity for any traveler caught in the mountains after dark. When Booth returned to the McCraw homestead the following morning, after spending an uncomfortable night wrapped in his traveling blanket beneath a rocky overhang approximately half a mile from the house, he found the sisters working in their vegetable garden as if nothing unusual had occurred the previous evening. Martha McCraw, who served as the unofficial spokeswoman for the family, approached him with what appeared to be genuine concern for his welfare and apologized for their inability to provide accommodation the night before. She explained that they had been attending to what she described as a delicate family matter that required their complete attention and made it impossible for them to receive visitors during the evening hours. Martha offered Booth breakfast and appeared perfectly cordial throughout their conversation, displaying the kind of mountain hospitality that was traditional throughout the region. However, Booth noted several deeply troubling aspects of their interaction that he recorded in detail upon his departure from the area. Most significantly, none of the three sisters would look directly upward during their entire conversation, even when natural circumstances would normally have caused them to glance toward the sky. When a flock of geese passed overhead during their meal, creating the distinctive honking sounds that typically drew attention from anyone in the area, all three sisters kept their eyes firmly fixed on either their food or the ground around their feet. Even more peculiar was their absolute insistence that Booth not enter the house to warm himself, despite the morning chill that made his breath visible and caused him to shiver throughout their outdoor meal. Instead of the customary invitation to sit by the fireplace that would have been standard practice among mountain families, the sisters served him cornbread and coffee on the front porch, with Ruth McCraw positioning herself between Booth and the front door throughout the entire visit. When Booth commented on the cold and suggested that they might be more comfortable continuing their conversation indoors, Martha McCraw became visibly agitated and firmly declined, stating that they preferred to take their meals outside whenever weather conditions permitted. Booth's journal entries indicate that he found this explanation completely implausible, given the obvious discomfort that all four of them were experiencing due to the cold temperatures. He noted that the sisters appeared to be wearing their heaviest winter clothing, despite the early season, and that Ruth McCraw was trembling so severely that she had difficulty holding her coffee cup steady. Yet, when he pressed the issue of moving indoors, all three sisters became so distressed that Booth decided to conclude his visit, rather than cause further upset to what he assumed must be a family dealing with some form of personal crisis or tragedy. The second documented incident that would later prove significant in understanding the situation at the McCraw homestead occurred in November 1907, when Samuel Ridway, a professional land surveyor contracted by Howell County to map property boundaries throughout the region, was traveling through the area during a severe thunderstorm that had developed with little warning. Ridgway's official report filed with the county clerk's office and preserved in the Missouri State Archives provides what may be the most detailed and objective account of conditions at the McCraw property during this critical period. as a county employee with professional training and observation and documentation. Ridgway approached his encounter with the sisters from a perspective that was both more systematic and less influenced by personal religious beliefs than the account provided by the traveling minister. Ridgway had been working in the area for several days, staying in various locations depending on his proximity to the land sections he was surveying. When the storm struck with unusual intensity, he sought shelter at the McCraw homestead because it was the closest substantial structure to his current work site. The sisters initially appeared reluctant to offer assistance, but the severity of the weather conditions and Ridgway's official status as a county representative apparently convinced them that they could not reasonably refuse to provide basic humanitarian aid to a traveler caught in dangerous circumstances. However, rather than inviting Ridgway into their house, as would have been standard practice throughout the region, the sisters insisted on arranging sleeping accommodations for him in their barn. Martha McCraw explained this unusual arrangement by claiming that they had no suitable guest room available in the house and that the barn would actually provide more comfortable lodging, since it had been recently cleaned and contained fresh hay that would serve as adequate bedding. Ridgway found this explanation questionable, particularly since the house appeared to be substantial enough to contain multiple rooms, but he accepted their hospitality rather than argue about sleeping arrangements while the storm continued to intensify around them. The barn where Ridgway spent the night was located approximately 50 yards from the main house, positioned to provide shelter from the prevailing winds, but still offering a clear view of the building through gaps in the wooden siding. Throughout the night, Ridgway observed lamp light emanating from what appeared to be an upper-story room of the house. Despite the sisters' earlier statements that they retired early and maintained no activities after sunset that would require illumination, the light appeared to move within the room, suggesting that someone was active in the space for extended periods during the night hours. When Ridgway inquired about these observations the following morning, Martha McCraw became notably agitated and insisted that no lamps had been lit anywhere in the house after sunset. Her reaction to his questions was so extreme that Ridgway initially wondered if he might have offended the family by appearing to spy on their private activities. However, Martha's denial was so emphatic and her distress so obvious that Ridgway began to suspect that something more serious might be involved in the situation than simple privacy concerns or family routines that they preferred not to discuss with strangers. More disturbing than the unexplained lights were the sounds that Ridgway documented in his official report. Throughout the early morning hours, beginning sometime after midnight and continuing until dawn, he was repeatedly awakened by what he described as rhythmic tapping or knocking sounds that appeared to originate from the direction of the main house. The sounds would continue for several minutes at a time, following what seemed to be a deliberate pattern, then stop abruptly for periods ranging from 15 minutes to nearly an hour before resuming with the same rhythmic characteristics. Each time these sounds awakened him, Ridgway would step outside the barn to investigate their source and try to determine what might be causing them. During these investigations, he observed that the shadowy figures of all three McCraw sisters were visible at different windows on the ground floor of the house, apparently listening to the same sounds that had disturbed his sleep. The sisters would remain at these positions throughout the duration of each episode, moving only when the sound ceased completely. Their vigil would continue until dawn, when the tapping stopped entirely and normal morning activities began around the property. Ridgway noted that the sisters' behavior during these night hours suggested they were familiar with the sounds and expected them to occur rather than being surprised or alarmed by unexpected disturbances. Their positioning at the windows appeared to be deliberate and coordinated, as if they were maintaining some form of watch or surveillance related to the source of the sounds. When Ridgway attempted to approach the house during one of these episodes to offer assistance or determine if the family was experiencing some form of emergency, all three sisters immediately disappeared from the windows, and the tapping stopped instantly, suggesting that his presence had somehow interrupted whatever was taking place. 7. Rumors had begun circulating among residents of the Mountain View community and the surrounding settlements regarding the McCraw sisters and their increasingly peculiar behavior patterns. According to testimonies collected years later by local historian Margaret Walsh and preserved in the archives of the Ozark Folk Center, several townspeople had attempted to visit the sisters during the early winter months, motivated by concerns about their welfare and the traditional mountain custom of checking on isolated families before the harsh weather of January and February made travel through the region extremely difficult or impossible. However, these well-intentioned visits resulted in experiences that were remarkably similar to those documented by Jeremiah Booth and Samuel Rigway. Visitors were consistently denied entry to the house itself, with the sisters insisting on conducting all conversations either outdoors or on the front porch, regardless of weather conditions that often made such arrangements uncomfortable or impractical. Multiple witnesses reported that the sisters seemed perpetually nervous and distracted during these interactions, frequently glancing toward their roofline and becoming visibly distressed whenever anyone mentioned hearing unusual sounds in the area or commented on activities they might have observed around the property. Dr. Thomas Henley, the local physician who served the scattered settlements throughout southern Howell County, traveled to the McCraw homestead in January 1908 to examine Ruth McCraw, who was reportedly suffering from what Martha described as severe fatigue and recurring episodes of nervous fits that had worsened significantly during the winter months. Dr. Henley's medical notes from this visit, preserved in his personal papers that were donated to the University of Missouri archives in 1952, provide the most detailed professional assessment of the sisters' deteriorating physical and mental condition during this critical period. According to Henley's careful observations, all three sisters appeared to be suffering from severe sleep deprivation and malnourishment despite having adequate food supplies visible in their kitchen and showing no obvious signs of financial hardship that might account for poor nutrition. The house itself was clean and well maintained, suggesting that the sisters were capable of caring for their domestic environment. Yet their personal appearance indicated that they were neglecting their own basic needs in favor of some other priority that was consuming their time and energy. Ruth McCraw, the patient he had been summoned to examine, exhibited what Dr. Henley described as extreme agitation and an apparent inability to remain still for more than brief periods. Throughout the examination, she would frequently interrupt their conversation to listen intently to sounds that Henley could not detect, often tilting her head toward the ceiling and holding her breath for extended periods, while straining to hear something that remained inaudible to the physician. When these episodes occurred, Ruth would become completely unresponsive to questions or attempts to redirect her attention, suggesting that whatever she was listening for had become an obsessive preoccupation that dominated her mental state. When Dr. Henley suggested that he examine Ruth in an upstairs bedroom, where she might be more comfortable and have access to proper bedding, all three sisters became so distressed that Martha McCraw ordered him to leave the property immediately. Their reaction was so extreme and so obviously motivated by terror, rather than simple preference or modesty, that Henley initially feared they might collapse from the apparent shock induced by his suggestion. The intensity of their response convinced him that whatever was troubling the family was somehow connected to the upper story of their house, and that they were desperately afraid of anyone discovering what they were trying to conceal in that area. Throughout Dr. Henley's visit, which lasted approximately 2 hours, he could hear what sounded like intermittent movement or shifting directly above the room where they were conducting the examination. The sounds were subtle but distinct enough to suggest that someone or something was active in the space overhead, despite the sisters' obvious efforts to maintain complete silence during his presence on the property. When Henley commented on these observations, suggesting that they might have animals or rodents in their attic space that could be creating health hazards or structural damage to their home, The sisters' reactions were so extreme that the physician later wrote he feared they might require emergency medical intervention to prevent complete emotional collapse. Esther McCraw, who had remained largely silent throughout the visit, began weeping uncontrollably when Dr. Henley mentioned the sounds from above. Her distress appeared to be genuine and profound, suggesting that she was experiencing psychological trauma related to whatever situation the family was concealing. Martha McCraw became so pale that Dr. Henley initially thought she might lose consciousness, and he prepared to administer medical assistance for what appeared to be an impending fainting episode. Ruth McCraw gripped her chair with such force that her knuckles turned white and her hands began trembling violently, while she began repeating the phrase, "Nothing there. Nothing there," in barely audible whispers that she continued for several minutes after Dr. Henley had stopped speaking. The physician's professional assessment, documented in his confidential medical notes, was that all three sisters were suffering from severe psychological distress related to circumstances that they were either unwilling or unable to discuss with outside authorities. He noted that their symptoms were consistent with prolonged exposure to traumatic stress, but that they refused to provide any information that might explain the source of their distress or allow him to recommend appropriate treatment. Dr. Henley's final recommendation was that the sisters should be encouraged to seek assistance from county officials or religious authorities, but he acknowledged that their obvious terror at the prospect of outside intervention made it unlikely that they would voluntarily seek help. The situation at the McCraw homestead remained largely unchanged throughout the winter and spring of 1908, with the sisters maintaining their isolation and continuing to refuse visitors entry to their house. Local residents gradually ceased attempting to visit both because of their own discomfort with the sisters' increasingly strange behavior and because of growing rumors about unexplained activities observed around the property. Several hunters and trappers working in the surrounding forests reported that the area around the McCraw homestead had become unusually quiet, with local wildlife appearing to avoid the immediate vicinity of the house in a manner that suggested the presence of something that animals instinctively recognized as dangerous or unnatural. Multiple witnesses reported observing lamplight in the upper story of the house during unusual hours, particularly during the period between midnight and dawn, when most rural families would have extinguished all artificial lighting to conserve fuel and lamp oil. The patterns of these lights suggested purposeful activity rather than random or accidental illumination, with observers noting that the brightness would vary and the light would move within the rooms, as if someone was actively working or moving about in the space. Several individuals attempted to investigate these observations by approaching the house during nighttime hours, but they invariably encountered responses that convinced them to abandon their inquiries and avoid future contact with the property. The first major development in the McCraw case occurred in June 1908, when Martha McCraw made an unprecedented journey to West Plains to speak privately with County Sheriff Daniel Morrison. According to Morrison's incident report, preserved in the Howell County Sheriff's Department records, Martha appeared at his office during the early morning hours, obviously distressed and requesting immediate assistance with what she described as an urgent family matter requiring complete discretion and confidentiality. She specifically requested that Morrison visit their homestead alone, without deputies or other witnesses, claiming that the situation was too delicate for public knowledge and that any breach of privacy might result in terrible consequences for innocent people. Sheriff Morrison, who had known the McCraw family for many years and considered them to be respectable and law-abiding citizens, agreed to make the requested visit within the week. His decision was influenced both by his personal relationship with the family and by Martha's obvious distress, which convinced him that she was dealing with a legitimate emergency rather than some minor domestic dispute that could be resolved through informal mediation. However, Morrison's subsequent report details what may be one of the most unsettling encounters documented in the early records of Ozark law enforcement, providing insights into a situation that challenged both his professional experience and his personal understanding of normal family dynamics. When Morrison arrived at the McCraw homestead on the morning of June 15, 1908, he found all three sisters waiting for him on their front porch, dressed in what he described as their finest church clothing. Despite the early hour and the fact that no religious services were scheduled in the community that day, their formal attire and obvious preparation suggested that they had been expecting his arrival and had made special arrangements to receive him. Yet their behavior throughout his visit indicated extreme anxiety and reluctance to proceed with whatever they had planned to discuss with him. Rather than inviting Morrison into their house, which would have been the normal protocol for receiving an official visitor, Martha McCraw immediately led him to their barn, where she had arranged chairs around a small table in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to create a formal meeting space away from the main residence. She explained that they needed to discuss sensitive matters privately before considering any visit to the house itself, and that the barn would provide the necessary privacy while allowing them to speak freely about family matters that they had never shared with anyone outside their immediate household. For nearly an hour, according to Morrison's detailed notes, Martha McCraw spoke in vague and often contradictory terms about family obligations and responsibilities that had become increasingly difficult to bear without assistance since their parents' death. She referred repeatedly to promises made and duties inherited that the sisters had been attempting to fulfill, despite lacking the resources or experience necessary to handle the situation properly. However, she refused to provide specific details about what these obligations involved, stating only that they had made serious mistakes in their attempts to manage matters independently, and that they now feared something terrible would happen if they continued to handle the situation without proper guidance. Morrison's growing frustration with Martha's evasive responses is clearly documented in his report, as he repeatedly pressed for specific information about what type of assistance the family needed and what circumstances had prompted Martha to seek official intervention after years of maintaining their privacy. However, his direct questions only seemed to increase Martha's distress, and she became increasingly agitated as she struggled to explain their situation without revealing details that she obviously considered too dangerous or sensitive to discuss openly. Even with a law enforcement official, she had specifically requested to help them. The most disturbing aspect of this conversation, according to Morrison's account, was Martha's simultaneous insistence that he needed to see what they had been dealing with in their house, combined with her obvious terror at the prospect of actually allowing him to enter the building. She led him toward the front door multiple times during their discussion, walking several steps in that direction before suddenly stopping and returning to the barn, claiming that she needed more time to prepare herself for what they would encounter inside the house. Her behavior suggested that she was caught between desperate need for official assistance and overwhelming fear of the consequences that might result from revealing their family's secret to outside authorities. When Morrison finally insisted on entering the house to assess whatever situation had prompted Martha to seek his help, all three sisters accompanied him to the front door, but refused to proceed any further into the building. Their reluctance appeared to stem from genuine terror rather than simple embarrassment or privacy concerns, and Morrison noted that they seemed to be struggling with conflicting desires to both reveal and conceal whatever they had been dealing with since their parents' death. Martha handed him a key and pointed toward a narrow staircase leading to the second floor, stating that he would understand everything once he reached the attic space at the top of the house. However, Martha's instructions for Morrison's investigation were so specific and unusual that they added to his growing concern about what he might discover in the upper story of the house. She emphasized that he must not call out or make any loud noises while exploring the attic, and that he should return to them immediately if he heard any sounds that seemed to be responding to his presence in the space. These warnings suggested that the sisters believed something or someone in the attic might react unpredictably to the presence of a stranger, and that such reactions might create dangerous or uncontrollable situations that could threaten everyone's safety. Morrison's account of his investigation of the McCraw attic remains one of the most detailed and disturbing aspects of this case, providing the only official law enforcement assessment of conditions that the sisters had been concealing for nearly 4 years. According to his report, the space had been converted into what appeared to be makeshift living quarters, complete with a bedroll, several personal items, including clothing and toiletries, and clear evidence that someone had been consuming regular meals in the area for an extended period. The arrangement suggested a degree of permanence that indicated long-term occupancy rather than temporary shelter or storage use. Most troubling were the numerous scratches and marks that had been carved into the wooden beams and floorboards throughout the attic space. These marks appeared to have been made over a considerable period of time, with some showing signs of weathering that suggested they had been created months or possibly years earlier. The patterns and depth of the scratches indicated that they had been made by someone using fingernails or small implements, and their random distribution throughout the space suggested that the person responsible had been confined to the attic for extended periods, with limited ability to move freely throughout the rest of the house. Morrison also documented the presence of a strong, unpleasant odor that he could not identify, but that suggested poor sanitation or the accumulation of organic materials over time. Several large stains on the floorboards appeared to have been scrubbed repeatedly, but had never been fully removed, creating discolored areas that suggested the spilling of various liquids over an extended period. The overall condition of the space indicated that while someone had been making efforts to maintain basic cleanliness, the circumstances of the occupancy had made proper sanitation extremely difficult or impossible to achieve. However, the most puzzling aspect of Morrison's investigation was that the attic space was completely empty of any human occupants when he conducted his examination, despite clear evidence of recent habitation, including food remnants that appeared to be fresh and personal items that showed signs of regular use. There was no indication of how someone might have entered or exited the area without using the staircase that provided the only apparent access to the space. The small attic windows were boarded shut from the inside, and Morrison's careful examination revealed no evidence of any external access points that might have allowed someone to leave the area undetected. When Morrison returned to the front porch to question the sisters about his discoveries, he encountered what may have been the most shocking development of the entire investigation. All 3 McCraw sisters had completely disappeared from the property, leaving behind their personal belongings, household items, and what appeared to be several days' worth of prepared food in their kitchen. Their absence was so complete and sudden that Morrison initially assumed they must be hiding somewhere on the property. But his extensive search of the buildings and surrounding grounds failed to locate any trace of their whereabouts. The sisters' departure appeared to have been both sudden and unplanned, as they had made no arrangements for the care of their livestock or the maintenance of their property. Their personal clothing, important documents, and valuable household items remained in the house, exactly as if they had simply stepped outside temporarily and intended to return within a few hours. Most puzzling was the fact that their disappearance seemed to coincide precisely with Morrison's investigation of the attic, suggesting that they had been monitoring his activities and had chosen to flee the moment he discovered evidence of the conditions they had been concealing. Morrison spent the remainder of that day and much of the following week attempting to locate the missing sisters and understand what had prompted their sudden departure. His inquiries to relatives and acquaintances throughout the region yielded no useful information, as no one had received any communication from the sisters indicating plans to travel or relocate. Most neighbors expressed surprise at news of their disappearance, but acknowledged that they had been expecting something like this to happen eventually given the sisters' increasingly strange behavior over the previous months. More disturbing than their disappearance was Morrison's discovery that the unexplained activities at the McCraw homestead continued even after the sisters had vanished from the property. During his subsequent visits to the abandoned house, Morrison documented several instances of sounds and disturbances that matched the descriptions provided by previous witnesses. Despite the building being completely empty of any visible occupants, his supplemental reports describe hearing movement in the attic space, muffled voices from the upper story, and other unexplained phenomena that suggested the presence of someone or something that remained concealed from normal observation. On one particularly disturbing occasion, Morrison reported hearing what sounded like conversation between multiple individuals coming from the second floor of the empty house. The voices were too indistinct for him to understand specific words, but the patterns suggested normal human speech, rather than random sounds or environmental factors. When he investigated by climbing to the second floor and systematically searching every room, he found absolutely no evidence of any human presence. Yet the sounds continued until his footsteps approached the areas where they seemed to originate, at which point they would stop abruptly and not resume until he had moved to a different part of the house. Local residents began avoiding the McCraw property entirely after word spread about the sisters' disappearance and Morrison's unsettling discoveries during his investigation. The house remained abandoned throughout the remainder of 1908 and into 1909, with no efforts made by county officials, family members, or potential purchasers to claim or maintain the property. Several attempts by prospective buyers to inspect the house resulted in experiences that were similar to Morrison's reports, effectively making the property unmarketable and forcing the county to assume responsibility for its maintenance and security. The next significant development in the McCraw case occurred in March 1909 when Margaret Walsh, a school teacher from Mountain View with interests in local history and folklore, decided to investigate the abandoned homestead as part of her research into unusual settlement patterns and family dynamics in the Ozark region. Walsh's detailed journal entries from this period, preserved in her personal papers at the Ozark Folk Center, provide what may be the most comprehensive civilian account of conditions at the property nearly 1 year after the sisters' mysterious disappearance. Walsh's initial observations indicated that the house showed clear signs of continued habitation, despite being officially empty and sealed by county authorities. Fresh ashes in the main fireplace suggested that someone had been maintaining fires recently, and dishes in the kitchen appeared to have been washed and arranged, as if the house was actively occupied. Most significantly, Walsh discovered that the makeshift living quarters in the attic had not only been maintained, but had actually been expanded and improved since Morrison's investigation, with additional furnishings and what appeared to be a more organized system for food storage and personal hygiene. However, Walsh's most important discovery came when she found a collection of letters and personal documents hidden beneath loose floorboards in what had been the sisters' shared bedroom. These materials, written primarily in Martha McCraw's handwriting and apparently never intended for outside eyes, provide the only direct account of what the sisters believed they were dealing with during the years leading up to their disappearance. The correspondence reveals a complex and deeply troubling situation that had been developing for much longer than anyone in the community had suspected. According to Martha's private writings, the sisters had discovered an individual living in their attic sometime during the winter following their parents' death in 1904. Rather than reporting this situation to local authorities, as would have been the normal response to finding an unauthorized person on their property, the sisters had decided to provide food, clothing, and basic necessities to what Martha described as a lost soul who had nowhere else in the world to turn for help. Her letters suggest that this decision was motivated by a combination of Christian charity and practical concerns about what might happen to both the individual and themselves if the situation became known to their neighbors and law enforcement officials. Martha's correspondence indicates that this arrangement had continued for several years, with the sisters developing what she characterized as a protective relationship with their hidden occupant. However, her descriptions of this relationship reveal troubling aspects that suggest the situation had become far more complex and problematic than the simple provision of temporary shelter that it may have started as. References to increasing demands and behavior that became more difficult to manage indicate that their hidden guest had gradually assumed a more controlling role in the household, making requirements that the sisters found increasingly difficult to fulfill while maintaining their normal community relationships. Most disturbing are Martha's references to their growing isolation from the community and their increasing dependence on the approval and cooperation of the person they were sheltering. Her letters suggest that what had begun as an act of charity had evolved into a situation where the sisters felt trapped by their own secrecy and unable to seek help without risking serious consequences for both themselves and their hidden occupant. Martha's increasing desperation is evident in her later writings, where she expresses growing fear about their ability to continue managing the situation independently and worry about what might happen if they could no longer maintain the arrangement that had come to dominate their lives. However, perhaps the most shocking revelation in Martha's private correspondence is the indication that the person they had been sheltering was not the homeless stranger that her earlier letters had suggested. References to family obligations and promises made to their parents suggest that their hidden occupant was someone with a direct connection to the McCraw family, possibly a relative whose presence in their household needed to be concealed for reasons that Martha never fully explained in her writings. This connection would explain the sisters' extreme reluctance to seek outside help and their willingness to endure years of psychological stress and social isolation, rather than reveal the truth about their situation. Walsh's investigation of these materials was interrupted when she experienced what she described as a direct encounter that convinced her the property remained dangerous for solitary research. While examining the hidden letters in the attic space, Walsh heard footsteps on the stairs below, followed by the sound of someone moving around deliberately on the first floor of the house. When she called out to identify herself as a researcher with legitimate purposes for being in the building, the sound stopped immediately, but she could distinctly hear what sounded like heavy breathing near the base of the staircase, as if someone was waiting just out of sight and listening to determine her location and intentions. Walsh remained in the attic for several hours, afraid to descend while someone appeared to be positioned between her and the only exit from the building. During this time, she could hear occasional sounds that suggested continued movement throughout the lower floor, including what sounded like doors opening and closing and the scraping of furniture being moved or rearranged. Eventually, the sound ceased entirely, and she was able to leave the house without encountering anyone. But her examination of the first floor before departing revealed clear evidence that someone had recently prepared and consumed a meal in the kitchen, despite the fact that the house had appeared to be completely empty when she arrived that morning. Following Walsh's frightening experience, county officials decided to seal the McCraw property indefinitely and post warnings against trespassing for public safety reasons. Sheriff Morrison arranged for the house to be boarded shut and stationed regular patrols in the area to discourage unauthorized visitors. However, these protective measures proved largely ineffective as subsequent reports continued to document unexplained activities at the site that suggested someone was continuing to access the building despite official efforts to secure it. Hunters and travelers in the area frequently reported seeing lamplight in the windows of the supposedly sealed house during evening hours, and several individuals claimed to have observed figures moving about the property during twilight periods when visibility was poor, but not completely absent. More troubling were reports from individuals who had approached the property during daylight hours and discovered that the board securing the doors and windows had been removed from the inside, suggesting that someone with access to the interior of the building was regularly entering and leaving the structure without using normal entry points that could be observed or secured by authorities. The final documented incident involving the McCraw home stead occurred in November 1909, when a severe storm system moved through the region and prompted emergency response efforts throughout Howell County. A search and rescue team led by Deputy Sheriff James Crawford was investigating reports of missing travelers in the area when they discovered that the protective boards securing the McCraw house had once again been removed from the inside, and that there was clear evidence of recent habitation throughout the building, including the attic space where the original disturbances had been documented. Crawford's team conducted the most thorough investigation of the property that had been attempted since Morrison's original examination, and their discoveries provided new insights into the scope and complexity of activities that had been taking place at the McCraw homestead. Most significantly, Crawford's systematic search of the building revealed the existence of a concealed room behind a false wall in the house's basement, a space that had apparently been unknown to previous investigators, and that contained evidence of long-term use for purposes that remained unclear, but appeared to be related to the sheltering of multiple individuals over an extended period of time. The concealed basement room contained personal belongings, clothing, and documents that appeared to span several decades, suggesting that the McCraw family's practice of providing refuge for individuals in difficult circumstances had begun long before the sisters' parents died and had possibly been continuing through multiple generations of the family. Some of the items discovered appeared to belong to individuals of various ages and backgrounds, indicating that the family had been involved in assisting a diverse group of people who shared the common characteristic of needing to remain hidden from normal community knowledge and official attention. However, the most unsettling discovery in the concealed basement space was evidence that suggested not all of the individuals who had sought refuge at the McCraw homestead had remained there voluntarily. Crawford's report mentions the presence of restraints and modifications to the room that appeared designed to prevent occupants from leaving independently, as well as scratches and marks in the walls that were similar to those found in the attic space, and that suggested prolonged confinement under conditions that had caused significant distress to the individuals involved. The accumulation of personal belongings from multiple individuals over many years raised serious questions about what had ultimately happened to the various people who had been sheltered by the McCraw family and why their possessions had remained at the property, rather than being returned to their families or disposed of in normal ways. Crawford's investigation team found items that appeared to belong to men, women, and individuals of various ages, suggesting that the family's activities had involved a complex network of people whose circumstances had required them to disappear from their normal communities and assume new identities or living arrangements that kept them hidden from official notice. Crawford's investigation was severely hampered by the deteriorating condition of many of the documents and personal items found in the concealed room, as well as by the complete absence of any living witnesses who could provide context for the discoveries or explain the family's activities. The McCraw sisters had never returned to the area or made contact with local authorities, and no relatives or acquaintances came forward with information that might have clarified the scope and nature of the family's involvement in these activities. Local residents, when questioned about their knowledge of the McCraw family's history, revealed that rumors about their practice of helping people who had nowhere else to go had circulated for generations. But most had assumed these referred to ordinary acts of charity, rather than the complex and potentially illegal activities that the investigation had uncovered. The mystery of what exactly had transpired at the McCraw homestead over the course of many years was never fully resolved through official investigation. County officials eventually determined that the scope of the case was beyond the resources and expertise of local law enforcement, and the property was transferred to state ownership, pending a more comprehensive investigation that was repeatedly delayed and ultimately never conducted. The house was finally demolished in 1912 due to safety concerns and the impossibility of finding buyers willing to purchase land with such a troubled history, and the basement space was filled in during the demolition process. However, even after the physical structures were removed and the site was allowed to return to forest, reports of unusual activities in the area continued for several more years. Local residents occasionally reported hearing sounds resembling conversation or construction work coming from the former location of the house, particularly during the early evening hours when shadows made visual confirmation of activities difficult or impossible. These accounts gradually became incorporated into regional folklore, though few people could provide specific details about what they had observed or experienced. And most explanations focused on natural phenomena or psychological factors, rather than any connection to the historical events that had taken place at the property. The artifacts that were recovered were briefly cataloged by state officials and then stored in a warehouse facility, where they were subsequently lost during administrative reorganizations that took place in the early 1990s. By the time researchers became aware of the potential significance of these materials and attempted to examine them for additional insights into the McCraw mystery, they could no longer be located in any state repository. The exact location where the discoveries had been made was now covered by several feet of asphalt and concrete, making any future archaeological investigation impossible. The loss of these potentially crucial pieces of evidence represented the final elimination of any realistic possibility that the remaining questions about the McCraw case might eventually be resolved through physical investigation or scientific analysis. For those who are familiar with the surviving accounts of the McCraw mystery, the case continues to raise fundamental questions about the responsibilities of families and communities toward vulnerable individuals and about the potential consequences when people attempt to address serious social problems through secretive or unauthorized, rather than seeking assistance from appropriate institutions and authorities. The apparent psychological and physical toll that the sisters' activities took on their own lives suggests that their efforts to provide care or protection, whatever form these efforts may have taken, ultimately created more suffering than they prevented. The McCraw case also illustrates the challenges faced by rural law enforcement and community leaders in identifying and addressing situations that involved complex family dynamics, potential criminal